Welcome back to the Tech Table, and today we'll be covering what's new on our CC2019 version of Premiere Pro. And I'll start by discussing a new way of working with display color management for Premiere Pro, something I've been waiting on for a long time, and a brand new way of working with complex curves in an all-new user interface inside of our Lumetri panel. We've also added data-driven graphics support, which now allows you to use data from programs like Excel and others that can create CSV and TSV data files. This really opens up a whole new way of working with titles and graphics and sheds a whole new light on what you can do with data moving keyframes. Our audio engineers have also been busy reworking two key elements inside the Essential Sound panel to give you even better sound when you need to start to reduce noise and reduce reverb. And finally, we're happy to show you our continued support for the VR community and all new support for VR 180. I'd like to thank Devin Supertramp for using his footage today, and a quick shout out to Team Supertramp. Now let's jump over to the desktop and take a quick look. Let's start by taking a look at one of the biggest changes in Premiere Pro CC 2019, and that's around color. One of the challenges we have when we're working with multiple programs like Premiere Pro and After Effects is getting consistent color between these two programs. And we've made a change in Premiere Pro that will help you. You can find the change under Preferences General, and there's a new checkbox to enable display color management. So I'm going to go ahead and check that. And now what you'll see when I bring up After Effects, you'll see consistent color between each of the output of the timeline. I'm going to go ahead and just reduce the size of After Effects down a bit so you can see the color on this composition and the color on Premiere Pro is exactly the same. And that's what we're looking for. Inside of After Effects, if you're not aware of it, you'll find the settings under Project Settings under the File menu, and here's where you just click on Color and you select the monitor that you're working with. And this is the initial work that we're beginning to do to really give you a dedicated color pipeline to make these programs consistent. Premiere Pro actually picks up that information that you saw inside of After Effects under the System Preferences Displays, and here you'll see under Color, it automatically picked the LG display that I'm working on. Let's switch over to the Color workspace and take a closer look at the new changes in the Lumetri Color Panel. As you'll recall from the last change that we made in CC 2018, we've now given you new controls in the Lumetri color area that allow me to switch to my scopes and still be able to turn effects off and on, as well as switch between the master clip effect and the actual clip effect, and again get to some various options under the Lumetri menu. Let's start by jumping over to the basic color correction area and then clicking on the input LUT and just grabbing a random LUT. I'll go ahead and grab this log 3 to Rec 709. And at first glance, it's looking a bit oversaturated. The water doesn't look correct to me, but that's okay. We're going to start to stack Lumetri effects to help me control the changes that I'm making so I can go back and turn them off and on and get an idea of how I want to work with this material. Let me show you how this works. One of the first things I want to do when I look at this image is crank up the exposure because it just looks too dark. But exposure is one of those settings that you really have to be careful with. And this new feature by stacking Lumetri effects that we've now added in CC 2019 is really going to help you control these types of changes that you make. Let me show you how this works. Let's start by adding a new Lumetri color effect. And what you'll see when I click on this drop down again is I now have two Lumetri color effects. I'm going to use the second one to help me control the exposure settings. Now my advice is to go ahead and rename this, and I'm going to go ahead in this example and call it exposure. So now what I can do is crank up the exposure and start playing around with some of this. But at any time, I can go back to this menu and I'll switch back to the first one. And you'll see this is where I added the LUT, and I can turn the LUT off And I can go back to the exposure and I can turn the exposure off. Go back to the Lumetri color effect where the LUT was and just turn the LUT back on. And again, go back to exposure and turn that one back on. It's a really quick way to look at the changes that you might be doing in a given area. You might want to go in and mask out the sky, start working on the blue or maybe the water area and start working on that area. It's just a great way to start working. You'll also notice that the stacked Lumetri effects also appear in the effects controls panel. So here's the first one that I added, and here's the second one that I've labeled exposure. Again, you still have the same control that you've always had with Lumetri, but now you can concentrate your area over on the right-hand side of the screen and therefore leaving your Lumetri scopes intact. One of the new areas that we've been working on is the curves areas. I'm going to collapse the basic color correction and expand the curves. And you'll see where we've added some new UI for some new controls. The general idea and the changes we've made in the curves area is really to take the guesswork when you're making adjustments when doing selective color correction. Let's start by jumping over to a new sequence. And for this image, I'm going to want to start adjusting the sky and maybe some of the grass. Now, before I get started on that, I'm going to go ahead up here and I'm going to add another Lumetri effect, and I'm going to rename that effect Sky. Let's go down to Hue Saturation, grab a color picker and select the sky. And what you'll notice down here is I now have 3 points that I can start to work with. I'm going to start with the middle point and I'm going to hold my shift key down, which is going to constrain this line to an up and down motion. I can't move it side to side accidentally, which will go ahead and modify that image maybe in a way that I'm not ready to do. So let's start by cranking the sky down a bit, and you'll notice it starts to remove a lot of that saturation. If I move it upwards, it's going to start to increase the saturation. This is one of my favorite new features. It couldn't be more intuitive. I know exactly what's going to happen before I start to do anything with that image. I either want to reduce the amount of color in that particular hue, or I want to increase it with the saturation. So I'll just crank that up a little bit. And now let's take a look at what happens if I don't hold the shift key down. So now you'll notice if I don't hold the shift key down, I can move this image side to side, and it might be affecting a part of that image that I don't really want to do. But you can certainly feel free to add more points and experiment with that. Now, speaking of adding more points, let's go ahead and play around with the grass. So again, I'm going to go up here and add another Lumetri effect. I'm going to rename that, and I'll just call that grass. And I'm going to click on another point here, and I'll just grab some of the grass over here. Again, let me just pull this down a little bit. And now you'll see that I've got this green area selected, and I'm going to go ahead and either increase that grass or decrease it. Now, as I mentioned before, when you don't hold the shift key down, you can now start to move this side to side. So again, when you hold the shift key down, it's locked. And when you don't hold the shift key down, you can now start to move that side to side. Now, what I might want to do at this point is start to widen how much of that grass I might affect. So now I'm going to start to affect some of those yellow areas. And as you see, I can start to move this and see some of those changes happening in real time. Again, it couldn't be easier when I'm looking at this. And one of the things that I really like when I selected this darker green grass area is if I just want to take the darker green grass down a bit, I can absolutely do that. It's really, really intuitive and really easy. Another thing that we've done is we've added a slider bar down here at the bottom. You will find yourself sometimes selecting a color maybe in this area here, and it actually extends over to this area, which can be kind of confusing to work. So if, for example, you had selected a color and you end up with something like this, you can always just move this back to the center. So again, remember that you do have this bar down at the bottom for recentering any of the colors that you're working on. And again, if you go back under the same area, again, I'm under this grass effect, effect and I wanted to affect maybe this lighter color grass, maybe I'll select this lighter color grass over here. You'll see it added another point right here, and I might want to be able to go in and increase some of that yellow area where you see these had gotten brighter. If you find yourself off the screen, just go ahead and center that area where you need to so you can work with it the most efficient way. Again, a great UI, and all of the new curve controls that we've added work this way. Let's take a look at how to work with hue versus hue in this example. For this one, let's say that I needed to change the color of the yellow car. And for continuity's sake, maybe I needed to turn it green for a green Corvette that was in another scene, maybe a lime green. So the easiest way to do this is you're going to want to start by selecting that color and then applying a quick mask. Why do I need a mask? Well, this particular color, yellow, might also pick up this battery charger or this unit that's right here behind the police car as it starts to pull out. And I don't want to do that. You remember before I did mention a mask. So let me just show you how to quickly do that. Let's start by selecting my clip and then going down to the hue versus hue. I'm going to grab a color picker and I'm going to pick just any point on this yellow here. Let's go ahead and recenter this. Click over to Effects Controls, and when you make a color selection with the eyedropper, you'll notice that the mask area here pops up. Now again, I always advise go in to rename that and change, let's just say change to green. And I'll click OK. Again, that's going to remind me what that setting does. And I'll just grab a quick pen tool here and just make a couple of quick selections here just to keep this quick. Again, I'd probably tighten this up, but I think for this it'll work pretty good. So the next step is to go ahead and add that mask to the additional frame. So I'm going to go ahead and just click this forward one frame at a time, and it looks like it's doing a fine job tracking that. That's a pretty easy one. And that's really all I need to do at that point. And I'll just wind this back. And that's all the tracking that I need to worry about. And now what I want to do is just come over here and start modifying that color. So I'll pull this down until I think I have a starting area. And remember, I told you, you can grab this area over here and start to pull this down a little bit so I have all the green that I needed to. Now again, if that green is too bright, you can come over here, click on the green, and then come over here and maybe just bring some of that saturation down just a little bit on that hue. And what you'll see when you click on this is a fairly clean and quick key as I was able to separate that out. And you'll notice that this green color did not bleed over into this charger that's here. Again, a really, really quick and easy way to start dealing and isolating colors. And again, in an example where I need to do hue versus hue. I'll do another one just to show you. Let's take the red that you see in the scene and just quickly change it to blue. Again, not very hard to do, but just to make a point. I'll wind this back a bit. Let's go ahead and add another Lumetri effect. I'll rename this red to blue. And let's go down to hue versus hue. Select this red maybe up here. And you see there's a perfect example of where the red spectrum needs to be recentered. So I just pull this back out. Again, couldn't be easier to work with. I just love this new UI. And I come over here and I'll just crank this up to blue. Again, you could mask this out. You'll start to see it starts to pick up some of the brake pads and things in here. But again, just to make a quick point, it's pretty easy to come in here and say, okay, well now I've got some other areas here. Let's go back in here, maybe widen this out just a touch and see how that does. Some of the stuff you can get away with for quick and easy stuff. But remember, at any time when you look at this and say, well, maybe that isn't giving me the effect that I want, is you can go right back up here and say, let's go back to red to blue, turn that one off, and we're right back where we started. Again, giving you that control, allowing you to turn which one of these stacked effects that you need to use off and on. And sometimes it's great to stack up a bunch of examples when you're working with a client or just trying to sit back and see what works best in that scene. Again, these controls are fantastic. In this next example, let's take a look at hue versus Luma. Now this clip already has a LUT applied, and I've already renamed this Lumetri layer, if you will, LUT, so I can turn this off or on as necessary. And I'm going to go ahead and create another effect, and I'll rename that one Darken Sky. Grab my color picker, grab the sky, and again I'm going to hold the shift key down, and I'm just going to pull the sky down so it darkens up just a bit. Really, really easy. You can see how to start to isolate colors with these color pickers, and then just think to yourself, do I want that color to be lighter or darker? I could go over to the grass, again adding another Lumetri effect, rename that one, call it grass, and let's just lighten this grass up here a little bit. It's looking a little green for me, and I'll just sort of crank that down a little bit and make it look a little more dried out like this grass here. And of course, at any time you can go in and combine any of these other effects. You're going to find yourself doing that a lot using multiple curves on one Lumetri setting. You'll also, in some cases, get better performance if you sort of group those together. I'm just separating this to sort of help you understand what each of the controls do. But for me, if there's any controls that I want to do on the grass, I would do all of them at one time. The more Lumetri effects you stack on top of each other, the more GPU horsepower you're going to take or require. Let's look at adding an RGB curve color change to this, just to show you another way to change this color, just in case you weren't aware of it. I can come up here and play around with the RGB curves. Again, before I do this, I'm going to go in and add another Lumetri effect. Let's rename this RGB adjustment. And I'll go ahead and just click on the blue here and make a quick S. Maybe change some of that blue. I'll even pop out some of that green there. And that actually is starting to look okay. But at the same time, I want to see what happens if I change the stacking order over here. Remember, I had talked about stacked Lumetri effects. The reason we call them that is you now have this ability, of course, to come over here and change the stacking order on how some of this worked. And I'll just pop this up here, and you can see it's having some slight change on the color of that sky depending on which one I apply first. So changing stacking order in the effects controls can certainly have an effect. Now, another thing to point out is these before and after changes. Remember, in the last version of CC2018, we introduced the new comparison view, and instead of working in this in a side-by-side view, I'm going to go ahead and work it in a vertical split view. And you'll notice in the center here, I have this line that I can start to use to see before and after. Now, I'm on the grass setting up here, and let's just go down and look at these settings up here, and I'm going to crank this grass up a little bit, and I'm going to take my saturation and I'm going to sort of see what those changes are. And it's an interesting effect because it's almost like I'm showing the grass actually, there's more grass over this effect. So by cranking down that color there in that particular situation, it really starts to give me a dramatic effect. And again, if I crank up to where it starts to lighten that effect just a bit more and I come back in, it starts to take some of that away. Very, very interesting way to start to look at all these different controls on how they can all work together. The last thing I'll do to this image is I'm going to skip over the Luma versus Sat. I'll get to that one in a minute, and I'm just going to quickly show you saturation versus saturation. So I'm going to select my color picker again. I'm going to select the blue, and what you'll notice here when I crank this down or I crank this up, it's now just isolating just the saturation of that blue. Again, as I sort of crank this down, I still have this in my vertical split view. I can start to see how that affects the entire image. All of the saturation of that image. You can start to see where it's picking up some of the greens because that does contain some blue there. But for the main part, I've isolated this blue area here. So I'm going to go ahead and turn comparison comparison view off and maybe just crank this up a little bit more to where I like that. So again, saturation versus saturation. And just a quick reminder, remember you do have these masking controls that you can use on any of these settings if you need to go in and isolate a certain area when you're trying to keep it from having an effect like we see on this grass. So again, just to point that out, there's lots of tools to help you get to where you need to be with your color settings. Let's talk about Luma versus saturation. I'm going to start just by scrubbing through this timeline here and just seeing some of the changes that we actually have going on with this particular clip and taking a look. So one of the things I see is I do see this, it's an overcast day. Maybe I need to match this with another clip. So I want to start bringing some of the blue out in that sky. So one of the first things I might start with, again, I'm going to go back to my RGB curves. This is a great use for this. Click on my blue curve there, just create another quick S and to see if I can pull some of that sky up here. And again, I don't want to take away from some of the green, so I'll bring that back. So now I notice this area up here, if I turn this off and on, I can start to see how I'm affecting that. Again, if you want to go in and rename this, and that looks pretty good. So now what I want to do is go down to the Luma versus Sat, and let's just select this blue here and say, well, I kind of want to crank up that blue area here. And let's just watch what happens as I start to pull this up. And I'm going to just give it a kind of an extreme. I've actually made it look like a little fake, I know, but I've actually kind of made it so that some of the clouds went away. And at this point, I'd probably just crank this down just a little bit, because remember, I want that blue sky there. And then again, I would just start working on the rest of some of the overcast and some of these other shots here and see what these starts to look like for me as I start to look at this. But overall, that sky is actually looking much, much better. I do start to have some blue here and there. And of course, right at the end here, I start to see where I've got some nice area there with the blue. So just a quick way to wrap up some of this area. Again, I think you're really going to like these new curve controls. Engineering's put a lot of work into really thinking about how we can make working with color even easier. Another great feature in Premiere Pro CC2019 is the ability to use motion graphics templates with data. We call this data-driven graphics, and we introduced it in After Effects in the last 2018 release. The data can come from applications like Excel or any application that can create a CSV or TSV file. Let's jump over to After Effects, and I'll just give you a general idea how these are created. Here you see the motion graphics template that we're going to be using, and in the Essential Graphics panel, which again we introduced back in the 2017 version, you can see all the options that the After Effects artist has allowed the Premiere user to modify. All of the graphics are controlled down here on the timeline in the After Effects composition. So again, this is a very comfortable area for an After Effects artist to be making all these graphics. But what we want to do is equip the editor the ability to modify any of these changes within Premiere Pro without having to know After Effects, or two, having to launch After Effects and modify and re-export a composition. So let me open this back up in Premiere and I'll give you an idea of what it looks like if you haven't seen these before. So back inside Premiere Pro, I'm going to switch over to my graphics workspace, and I'm going to go down here at the bottom, and I'm just going to sort by recent ones that I've either imported or some of these you can actually create inside Premiere. So I'm going to go ahead and just grab this one here, which was the same one I had inside of After Effects, and I'll just go ahead and add this, and I'm going to make this the same size as my 4K sequence, and I'll just drag this out so you can get an idea of what's on there. So here you see I've got a title here, I've got a miles per hour, and I've got an outside temperature. Now these might be information that someone feeds me for this particular graphic if we're working on something where this data is critical to the story that we're telling. You'll see up here we now have an Edit Spreadsheet Data button, so I can now click on this. And I've got areas that I can go in here and modify. So here's where you see flyboard gauge, this text up here. I can see speed here and temperature here. And then there's some values here, which looks like I can go ahead and modify this. And you see it's modifying that graphics. That's what the After Effects artist was putting together. And over in this area, you see I've got two different colors. These are going to represent the colors here. And the After Effects artist has given me the ability to modify those colors. However, these colors are hex values. So if you're not familiar with those, let me jump over to Photoshop and just show you where those numbers came from. So inside of Photoshop, I've got an image here. I'm going to go ahead and just double click on my color here. And I've got a color picker. And let's just say that I needed to come in and modify some of these colors. I can come in here and move this to a little brighter pink color here. And the number down here, this hex value, I'm just simply going to copy, go back over to Premiere, and I'm just going to paste that number right here. So this pink area here might again be critical to the story. However, as an editor, I might not be responsible for that data. That may come from another source, and again, it could be controlled by a spreadsheet. Not only do we give you a new method to input this data, we also give you the ability to browse a spreadsheet and import that data live and automatically. Click on Browse. I'm going to select the spreadsheet that I've been told to use for this particular assignment. So I'm going to click Open. And you'll see it's imported all of this information. It's changed the word to Las Vegas. Maybe that's where I am at this particular point. And it's changed the colors and the hex values. In this particular case, you see I can't really even modify these because these are coming from a spreadsheet. Once you add the spreadsheet there, it's now live. So let's jump over to Excel and I'll show you what I mean. So here inside Excel, I'm going to go in here and I'm just going to put in another text. And I'll change some of these values around here. And I'm going to go ahead and change this particular hex value to that same one that we copied in Photoshop. And then I'm going to save the spreadsheet, go back into Premiere, and you see it's already updated this live from the Excel spreadsheet. This is a very exciting part of what's coming for Premiere Pro, and we're really excited to see what you guys can do with data-driven graphics. Premiere Pro CC2019 also introduces two new audio plugins, one for denoise and one for de-reverb. I'll give you a quick run through with these two examples. On the timeline, I've got basically two different microphones. I have the microphone that the actor's using in the video that you see, plus we have an on-camera mic that we might be using for sync audio for another purpose. But as we all know, sometimes when you lose the audio, on-camera mic audio is all you have. So we're going to show you how to work with this in this particular situation, trying to get the camera mic to sound as best as it can using both these two new audio plugins. I'll start with tagging these audio clips as dialogue. So I'm going to select all three and select the dialogue button. This now adds a tag for dialogue and then gives me options so I can start to work with it as dialogue. To give us a reference, let's start by listening to the microphone he's actually talking on before we listen to the other mics. And as you can see, the other mics on these channels have been muted. So the only mic we're listening to, again, is the mic that he's talking on.
How do you leave a footprint? Well, first you're gonna have to leave home. Go to the crazy place, even if no one's coming.
And now let's listen to the on-camera mic. So I'm going to go ahead and mute his main mic and unmute the on-camera mic. And let's play that back and hear the difference.
How do you leave a footprint? Well, first you're going to have to leave home. Go to the crazy place.
So the on-camera mic clearly had a lot of background noise. So I'm going to go ahead and select this track and then jump up to the essential sound and click on a brand new reduce noise algorithm. I'm going to move this up to 6.5 or so, and then let's play this back.
How do you leave a footprint? Well, first you're going to have to leave home. Go to the crazy place, even if no one's coming.
The reduced noise has been there for a while, so let me show you what the change is. I'm going to jump over to the effects controls, and you'll see now in the effects controls, reduced noise now uses the denoise effect, which results in a much cleaner sound. On track number 3, I've already applied the reduce noise with the new denoise effect. I want to go ahead and reduce the reverb. So let me start by muting track 2 and then unmuting track 3. And let's select track 3 and then click on reduce reverb. When you check this, the default setting at 5.0 here actually equals 50% here. So you can use either one. It's just really nice to be able to have all of this control right here and save this UI for something else that you might need to be monitoring. And let's go ahead and play that back so you can hear the difference.
You're gonna have to itch to fail and then start from scratch. If you're gonna take advice,
Definitely sounds way better. 2 great updates to the Essential Sound Panel that I plan to use all the time. The last area I'll review on this update centers around our new support for VR 180. I'll start by just right mouse clicking on this Zcam footage here and creating a new sequence from the clip. You'll notice when I look under the sequence settings that it's detected this footage as 180 by 180. Again, the new support for the camera. These VR properties actually come from metadata on the clip itself. If for some reason it comes in as a 360, you can always just reset it here back to 180 by just typing in 180. So you always have full manual control if you need it. And now I'll just toggle my VR display. And for me, I like to have a bit more real estate. I'm going to go to the wrench menu here and go to my VR properties, and I'm going to turn off show controls. That just gives me a bit more room. And you'll notice as I look at this, it stops at that 180. And I'm given that 180 experience that I would come to expect. Now, I will be honest with you, it's hard to appreciate 180 video when you're editing it here in Premiere unless you have a headset on, which of course Premiere Pro has supported for a few releases now. And when you get a chance to experience 180 video, you'll quickly see why it's catching on so quick. We've also updated our effects to support this new 180 format as well. So let me show you how that works. I'm going to go ahead and just grab my logo here and stretch this out. And you'll notice that when I come over here, it's actually not in VR space just yet. So I'm going to go over to my effects and I'm going to grab the plane to sphere, and let's just go ahead and apply that. And you'll see it pops up right here on my screen. And I can go over to effects controls. I see the VR plane to sphere, again, taking a flat object and bringing it into a 360, or in this case 180 VR experience. And I'm going to flip down scale, and obviously all of the things that I would expect to be able to do with this in VR space, I have full control over these properties as well as keyframing those. Let me bring this up full screen and just give you an idea what this starts to look like. It's really, really nice and really awesome. And that's a quick update on Premiere Pro CC2019.